But I suspect I'd have every faith that in the long run, in a broad trade war of this type of protectionism, the United States is perfectly placed to win it.
Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about tariffs because Donald Trump has slapped, yes, you have to use the word slapped, significant tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and slightly less, though still very significant tariffs on China too. And he is gearing up to impose more on Europe and possibly Britain. We wait and see. And it's causing all sorts of conniptions in the media and in the markets too. To discuss this subject, I am delighted to be joined by our economics editor, Kate Andrews, who's here with me, and the leader of the Social Democratic Party, William Clouston, who takes not the conventional view, I'd say, in Westminster circles on Donald Trump's tariff policies. Kate, let's begin. Seems to be very bad news if you talk to anyone who knows about the city, talks about the city, writes about the city. How disastrous is it, do you think?
We can probably extend that further. Economists on the left and right don't tend to agree on much. They tend to think that rent controls are a bad idea, and they tend to think that free trade is a pretty good thing. So tariffs of this size have terrified quite a lot of people, not least because Donald Trump has slapped. Is that the lingo? Yeah.
You have to say slapped.
You have to say slapped.
Can't say imposed.
Certainly not. Not even levied. He has slapped tariffs on his neighbors to the north and the south at 25% on the goods coming into the country, an additional 10% on China. To compare this to what he did in his first term, it makes those first 4 years look like a quite mild warm-up to what we're seeing now, and nobody is quite prepared for just the incredible global impact that this is potentially going to have. Now, Donald Trump might say you should be prepared because I was talking about it for my entire election campaign. But if you spoke to people who were close to Team Trump or in Trump world, they would say, no, this is all a negotiation tactic. And I think what's particularly confused and confounded markets, and we're seeing that today as the stock market dips all over, is that people really did think there was going to be more of a negotiating process, that it wasn't going to be almost immediately into Trump's first term that he was going to slap these tariffs on his neighbors. And the next question is, how much further does this go? He's saying that the EU is in his sights for the first time in a long time. He's talking about the UK. We can come on to what it might mean for the bloc and what it might mean for the Labour government later. But this is a pretty monumental moment, and you can tell that Trump is enjoying it for the most part. I think he sees these outcries as just more confirmation that he has crushed his critics and he has defied consensus once again. The question is whether or not it's going to work. And this is all on Donald Trump's shoulders because he's decided to use executive orders. He hasn't gone through Congress. If prices do start to drift up quite dramatically for the American people, that's going to very much be at odds with his other promise to bring prices down for the American people. We know he loves tariffs. Perhaps people should have been better prepared. But the consequences are definitely going to be for Trump to own. William,
Donald Trump thinks that the economic orthodoxy on tariffs is just wrong, and that his tariffs will not be inflationary, and that they will just make America richer, and they will force allies to behave in a proper way towards America, or suffer consequences. Is he entirely wrong, or do you think he's right?
I think he's broadly right, actually. And the first thing I'd say about what he's done, yes, it's very abrupt, but it does represent a political victory. It represents a political victory among the type of people that have been arguing for this within the Trump coalition. Obviously, it's a bit like the Brexit coalition, isn't this? It's quite large. But the people that have been arguing for a degree of protectionism, the people that are very critical of running constant, large, persistent trade deficits, people like Bob Lighthizer and Steve Bannon, actually, have won the day. So whatever happens economically, politically, this is a victory. I don't see it as transitory. I think the world is turning into a more protectionist phase. So I think it won't be. It was very, very interesting to watch Poilievre's. I mean, Poilievre almost certainly will be Canada's leader soon. And his reaction was very much Canada first. And all of his emphasis in reaction to these abrupt tariffs on an ally was to say, how can we make Canada more resilient? How can we build up our own industry? Which is exactly the right response. I think I've argued for years that we're far too indifferent to what is made where and by whom, and far too indifferent to who owns what. So I think it'll be messy, Freddie. I think there'll be a bit of blood on the floor. I don't actually think it'll be inflationary. I'll explain why if you like. But I think in the long run, he will probably win, largely because he is a deficit country. The people that have a great deal to lose are the surplus economies.
But I suppose the way in which it might backfire for Trump, William, is that if other countries start to think of themselves first, that could be disadvantageous to a global economy that has, in many ways, benefited America. I know that there's a lot of people in America who don't feel the benefits, and that's why Trump is popular, and so on. But the fact is, the American economy dominates the global economy because of unprotectionist measures in other countries.
I'm not sure I agree with you. From America's point of view, it depends whether you think it matters. I'll go back to this point of running persistent trade deficits. Go back to the basic trade economics. You can pay for your imports by exporting something or by selling assets or by issuing debt. So if you constantly run these huge deficits, you will just on the maths get poorer. I'm not putting an ideology forward. I'm just making a basic point about mathematics. So the people that think that's important, and also the people that have noticed that if you get on the train at Penn Station, you get on Philly, and you see factory after factory closed and despoiled, and you see your industries gutted, that's had a cost to workers. And people are inclined, particularly economists, are inclined to forget about the fact that it's political economy, right? So who are the winners and losers? Well, the blue-collar workers, the industrial workers, the former industrial workers, the towns, the cities that used to be productive in the United States and in the UK that are now opioid centers and full of dysfunction and underclass, they've paid the price. I think what's happened is, that's why I said at the start, it's a political victory for the people that want to stand up for those citizens. And I think they're right to do so. I think in the long run, I think it probably will be massive. In the long run, they'll probably be better off.
Kate, it's all about deficits, ledgers of deficits.
I don't think we can be terribly surprised that the world's richest country is importing more, consuming more, and interested in more choice, and thus has a trade deficit with large parts of the world because it's Americans that want to buy the products. The problem with tariffs, and this is where Donald Trump has been misleading. I think regardless of whether or not you agree with his philosophy, this is where the president has been misleading. He insists that other countries pay the price. Now, they might feel pain. They might pay a different kind of price, but it's going to be American companies that are paying these costs, and they're going to pass it on to the consumer. And I think this is where things get muddled, because his vice president, J.D. Vance, makes the philosophical case for tariffs, and he addresses this point. He doesn't hide it. He did a big interview, I think, with the New York Times last year, where they said, what do you think about taxes? And he said, well, tariffs are taxes, and that's the kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, tariffs are taxes, and that's the kind of tax I would like to see go up. I think it's the Tax Foundation in America that has calculated that this new lot of tariffs is going to cost your average American household hundreds of pounds more a year. There are people like J.D. Vance who might be willing to say that is a trade-off I'm willing to make if it advances American industry, if it advances the American worker. Those are big ifs. I mean, American industry now relies so much on imports, even in its own manufacturing, to make these products. So the idea that, you're going to get through this without pain, and even Donald Trump now admits there's going to be some pain, isn't going to happen. But Donald Trump has never really made that case. Donald Trump has always implied that his tariffs are a negotiating tactic because he loves to oversee economies that are booming. He loves to be the guy that makes you richer, that makes you feel better off. And that is where tariffs get much, much trickier, because he has promised in the same campaign to bring down the cost of food. Well, about 2/3 of vegetables consumed in America are imported from Mexico. He's promising to bring down the cost of energy. A real way that Canada can retaliate is with its crude oil, which America heavily relies upon. He's promised to bring down prices whilst going for these huge tariffs. And I think that's a difficult area for the president. He's never really made the philosophical commitment to the impact of tariffs. It's more for him the negotiating tactic. And then the question is, well, what do you want to get out of this? And I think William's completely right to point out that we shouldn't be indifferent. But Canada, for example, has got to be baffled by why it is in this grouping with Mexico and China. Donald Trump is talking about cracking down on illegal immigration and fentanyl. Now, illegal immigration from Canada has been rising, but not nearly at the levels, not even close to what we've seen from Mexico. Same goes for the transportation of drugs. So why you would do this almost universally is a big question. And it also raises huge questions for the EU and for the UK. On paper, the US actually has a trade surplus with the UK, and yet Donald Trump, although he said he thinks tariffs can be avoided, is bringing the UK into the mix. This gives a sense that there isn't really a coherent strategy yet behind the tariffs, except from what we already know from the previous term of Donald Trump, is that he thinks if he uses them, he can get more of his way. And that might be true, but that's why when William talks about the political win, it's certainly a win for a certain kind of protectionist ideology. It's just one that Trump has never fully articulated. And I think for Trump, the political win is getting other countries to bend to his will, whether that be on immigration, perhaps defense and NATO spending. That could be a big part of tariffs on the EU. And that's yet to be seen, and we may not see the changes for some time.
William, do you want to respond to that? And particularly this point, I think, that is quite interesting, that Donald Trump seems to be advancing a sort of national capitalism, whereas J.D. Vance and voices like that are perhaps more in the social democratic model, which you would align yourself with.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm much more on aligned with Vance. I think Vance is the real deal, and if he gets it, so philosophically, I think there's more underpinning. Let's say that, and I agree. I think it's slightly erratic. I mean, it's slightly puzzling to lash out at Canada. If you strip out hydrocarbons going south from Canada to the States, that the trade is pretty much in balance. So it's slightly odd. But just to nail this question about inflation, because the people that hate the idea of tariffs are always going to say it's going to be terrible, the outcome is dreadful, it's going to be inflationary. Well, before coming on, I just had a look at the size of the economy in the States. So basically, consumption represents, goods consumption is about 31% of the economy, and imports is about 16%. The imports from the three countries he's nailed now represent about 7% of GDP. So look, prices might go up. They won't go up, of course, on all products affected by the tariffs, because some products will be quite inelastic, some will be elastic. It depends. And actually, in the long run, a point you've made, Freddie, is that some will be substituted by domestic production. That's exactly what Vance and Trump probably want. But it's too early to say yet. But I suspect I'd have every faith that in the long run, in a broad trade war of this type of protectionism, the United States is perfectly placed to win it.
Well, the next, and perhaps very quickly we'll be onto it, phase, will be Europe. And as I understand, pharmaceuticals, America imports a lot of pharmaceuticals from Europe. And unless domestic production can plug that gap very quickly, that will mean, I assume, price rises for drugs in America, which is already a very expensive place medically. Drugs cost a lot of money in America. That could cause huge political pain very quickly, could it not, William?
Well, it could, but it's up to, you see, it depends how blunt an instrument Trump wants to yield. It's up to him. You can put a different tariff on a different product if you want in different categories. So, it really is a matter for Trump. I think he's done it in a very crude way, a very quick way. Whether he repeats it and just slaps 25% on all EU trade with the United States, I don't know. But I get back to that. I make my point always on particular markets. One of the best ones to look at is Chinese EVs, electric vehicles. There's a price advantage in the market in Europe and the United States by Chinese EVs, about a third. Now, the public will buy them because they're a third cheaper. So my point is that if you sit there like a lemon, you will lose your entire automotive industry. Eventually, the Chinese will eat a lot. And the reason they'll eat a lot is that you practice free trade, but it's not fair trade. I don't think the conditions that Chinese workers have experienced are the same as the ones we have. I'm very critical of Britain, for instance, having no tariff at all on Chinese EVs. That's why you see so many on the streets. The European Union have a lower tariff against Chinese EVs than the United States, But actually, Biden, influenced by Trump, has it right, 100%. So this is just sensible, in my opinion. I think a lot of the world, we've had sort of free trade liberal ideology dominating for 30, 40 years. And I think this is a real inflection point, and I'm very excited about it.
Kate, you're not excited about it. That's fair to say, isn't it?
I'm deeply worried that America is actually about to maybe not fall completely, but start to slip from its position of global power. And that might seem like a slightly odd thing to say given the current position it's in. But when America acts in this way towards its most important and closest allies, trust is lost quickly. I think countries like Russia and China's not happy right now with this 10% levy, right? But they look at the way that Donald Trump is talking about the European Union, is talking about Canada, of all places, mocking these countries, insulting these countries. And it's fundamentally a win for people who, as William just points out there, really don't respect human rights on the same level, really don't offer the same kind of important philosophical gains that the West has been able to bring to the world. And that makes me very nervous. And the decision to do it through what we know has actually lifted so many people out of poverty, has made us richer, has made us more prosperous, has made us more successful. To do it through the means of trade wars, to go after trade in this way, yeah, it is pretty baffling to me. But whenever Donald Trump does something that's baffling, I step back and I go, okay, why is he doing it? And I think William has articulated a lot of the reasons in which he's decided to go for this. The fact that there's so many American workers who are out of jobs, out of luck, have seen their communities crumple around them. And this is where J.D. Vance in his book, Hillbilly Elegy, is just so incredibly important. They're frustrated with that and they want to see a return to something. But Donald Trump tried to return a lot of that industry from 2017 onwards. He insisted he was going to make America this great manufacturing country again. And again, the tariffs ended up getting him some things he wanted at the margins. Ultimately, it didn't lead to that massive boom that he promised. Now, perhaps even bigger tariffs will, but I think the evidence is incredibly weak here. That the stronger evidence is that this is going to be an incredibly expensive project, certainly for the American people and for anybody who has to experience these tariffs. And again, I don't think the president is being completely honest or upfront about that. I mean, some of his comments are really funny and people are wrong to be so earnest about them. The latest being that if you don't love tariffs, you're somehow a shill of China, or that if you love America, you have to love tariffs. People who don't love tariffs don't love America. Part of this is him having fun. Part of this is him asserting his power. I think what I'm just mostly shocked by, as I hinted at before, is that Donald Trump's number one priority in his first term was to oversee a healthy and robust economy. Now, if Donald Trump really believes that this level of tariff on key allies is how you're going to get a robust economy overnight in America, because he really cares about the short term, that is an incredible pivot in his thinking, and he actually has never been very forthcoming about it. And as I said, he's going to have to own it because he did this without his government. He did this completely on his own via executive order. That's how I get my head around perhaps where Donald Trump is or where he's going. But that doesn't mean there aren't going to be consequences to what he's decided to do.
William, I'll let you reply to that. It seems to me, just observing you and Kate talking, that the difference might be on whether the last 30 to 40 years have really been that prosperous, and perhaps we're not just talking about economics here.
Yeah, I mean, my first port of call, really, the first point I make when I debate free trade liberals is to take a look around at what the situation is now, right? So in our own economy, we probably want to talk about that. We've had 30, 40 years of prioritizing services, and particularly London and the Southeast, but the Midlands and the North have deindustrialized, extensively. I mean, 1980, manufacturing is about 32% of the GDP, probably about 9% now. Basically, we've lost it. And a lot of that 9% is food production for the domestic market, so all the necessity is here. So the effects, my point is that the effects of this free trade project, and it is utopian. Historically, I think what Trump and Vance are doing now is actually a return to history. I think you've had an experiment, and it's not really worked. And you only have to look at a lot of what government does in Britain now, as I said before, is mopping up the blood. Many of the cities like Birmingham, Manchester, you've got places like Hartlepool and Blackpool with 25% of adults on some sort of out of work benefit, and that's the point. I mean, the rhetoric I use, it would be cheaper to keep the factories open. The cost of this economic failure is absolutely stark. So if you want to argue in favor of the status quo, that's what you've got to argue. You've got to argue it's working. And my point, and JD Vance's point, is not working. And people obviously have a right to say, I think we should do a turn in this direction or that direction, try and cure it. I think reindustrialization, reshoring, and less indifference about where stuff is made and who owns what, I think would do us a lot of good.
Well, actually, let's talk about Britain, since you both want to talk about it. Given our current trade position, first to you, William, and then to Kate, given our current trade position with America, would, let's say you're Prime Minister, William, which one day I hope you will be, would the sensible thing to do then to respond to Trump's saying we don't, we might leave the UK alone, to say actually Britain should be slapping more tariffs and protection against the overreaching American economy?
Well, first on the trade stats. So this is highly contested. Kate said that the Americans have a trade surplus. The ONS seem to think we have, if you go on the website. So,
well, that is important to point out. It's a technical paperwork issue that Donald Trump happens to think that the U.S. has the trade surplus. There is a big debate about it, but it makes him happy to see the numbers he sees.
Right.
Yeah, but I think the UK has a trade surplus with the United States, and actually, I've argued the first thing I will do is not sign any free trade agreement. I mean, if it works for us, because I really think it matters, Freddie. I think it matters. It's not just some economists, particularly free market economists, are inclined to look at flow all the time. They're looking at the flow of trade and thinking that's good, but you've got to look at the stock. What do you end up after you've done the trade? And I'll give you an instance of this. Was Liz Truss's Japanese free trade agreement, which she was bragging about. But if you looked at it, her own department modeled it and said that we've got a bilateral trade deficit with Japan now. And Liz Truss's agreement is going to make it worse. It's projected to increase Japanese exports to us by 80% and our exports to Japan about 30%. So it's going to get worse. And I would argue you're going to end up poorer as a result. It's not a sensible thing to do. So the first thing I would do on the USA is leave it alone. There's not a lot you can do if Trump applies tariffs. I don't know whether he would. But look at how incompetent the UK government has been on the basics. Perfect example. The biggest single, by category, the biggest single export of the United States to the UK is crude oil. But this government is refusing to open up the Rosebank oil fields near Shetland. That is crazy. What are they doing? About half of the UK's trade deficits are accounted by with energy imports. And that's a mess that our own government has got into, Tory and Labour, by just being indifferent to where stuff's made. You've got to get with it and start producing energy here.
Well, Kate, what do you think about that? I mean, it certainly seems true. If we are at a turning point in history, our government seems to be singing from the old hymn sheet.
I think I found an area of overlap of agreement between William and me, and it is on this point about what governments can do to roll back their own regulations, their own glass ceilings, their own caps on their ability to be prosperous and to move forward almost regardless of how other nations decide to act, because in many ways that is out of your control. I mean, if I were the Labour government, I would be trying to be as quiet as possible for as long as possible so nobody really noticed that no one has slapped tariffs on me. And also so my European friends and allies who I was trying to do more trade with didn't get very angry or jealous that I was exempt from tariffs that they almost certainly are going to have to experience. How long the Labour government can do that, I don't know. But I would certainly try to be friendly to both sides. William and I very much disagree about past 30 or 40 years. I think that broadly speaking, the huge expanse of trade and what many call globalization now has made us all more prosperous, certainly for those at the bottom, but also for those at the top. And it's given us so much more choice. It's given us more personal autonomy. I think across the board, this has been a very good news story, but I would never advocate for the status quo. I think that so much of what's holding us back, I think those areas you talked about, Birmingham, outside of Manchester, just, basically move outside the southeast. I think it is the government that time and time again has been failing those communities to not give them the opportunities to build anything new. They are the ones stuck in the past. They are the ones who have not been able, the government, the politicians, they are the ones who've not been able to look at the regulations and what is keeping this cap on the UK and say, how do we get new industry? How do we create better jobs? The fact that it takes 12 to 15 years to build any energy infrastructure in this country, the fact that it is impossible to build more homes, the fact that you are subject to the same kind of corporation tax in Birmingham as you are in London, or in Manchester as you are in London. I mean, that is outrageous. There should be far more competition, even within the UK, to get industry more attracted to other parts of the UK and to actually give them reason to go there. I don't think it's America's fault. I don't think that it's India's fault or China's fault, frankly, that Birmingham is in the state that it's in. I think that it's absolutely crucial for UK politicians to take account of their responsibility in that. And that is why, and it's a good time to talk about it, one of the merits of Brexit is that you can't outsource these problems anymore. You can't point your finger at the EU. You can't point your finger anywhere else. You have to take accountability for what's gone wrong in your own country. I personally don't think that it's far too simplistic to say it's free trade. The issue is where the government has come in and actually said, no, we're going to stop you from taking advantage of all that the world has to offer to bring it here and to build anything new.
William, I'll let you reply to that, but particularly let's focus on that Brexit point, because it seems to me the very fact that Trump might be ruling Britain out of these tariffs suggests a Brexit benefit that possibly isn't being discussed in most parts of the media.
Yeah, he may. I mean, I think it's interesting how sentiment, Trump's own view today, seems to be influencing his policies here. So I don't think they're entirely sort of evidence-based. I think if we're lucky, Britain may just escape it. I've said before, I think some of the things that members of our government have said about Trump is not helpful. You have a foreign secretary that compared Trump to a neo-Nazi. I think it's very foolish. I think it's foolish of Starmer to appoint him as foreign secretary, given that he'd said that. So we may be lucky. We may well be lucky. But no, I'll agree with Kate on this point. I think the misgovernance, I think it's the whole package that counts. I think the broad trade rules that your economy has to abide by do set the tone for what is going to happen. And they're extremely powerful. Give an example, the single market, the EU single market. Go on to trading economics, have a look at the size of the UK's trade deficit, look at it before and after the single market. The single market is basically a boxing ring. If you're not a heavyweight, if you haven't got cheap power and you're not at the center of it, if you're not Germany, basically, you did denaturalize. That's just what happened. It happened to Portugal, Italy, Greece, and it happened to us if you're on the edge. So I think that the macro trade rules are important. But I totally agree with Kate that just government incompetence and ineptitude has really contributed to it. We preside over a housing market, which is our macroeconomic, from a domestic point of view, our biggest problem. That's just sheer incompetence. The planning system is blocked, and state sector capacity in house building has been deliberately destroyed. So no matter where you look at energy, the Tories deliberately closed down British nuclear fuels. This was an industry that Britain pioneered and led in the 50s and 60s. Blair let it go, preferred to engage in expensive foreign wars or do anything sensible like look at energy resilience. And you are where you are. So I think the Labour and Tory parties really are a lot to blame for this. I'm not denying that. Absolutely right.
Finally, Kate and William, I'm going to ask you to do a boring prediction.
Oh, no.
Will Trump's tariff put the US into recession over the next year?
My prediction, which I'd just like to say to viewers, is probably wrong. I'm not confident here. is that it probably won't come to that. I wonder if these tariffs are long for this world, and if perhaps a 25% tariff on Canadian goods is not going to last long. Let's not forget that in his first term, the US and Canada played the trade war game and then quietly dropped it about a year later. I would not be surprised if so-called concessions were made and they managed to get round this.
William, your turn to make the prediction. Will the US be in a recession in a year's time as a result of Trump's tariffs?
No, highly unlikely for many reasons. But the biggest one is that it's only part of the economy. Most of the economy of services will be largely unaffected. And as I say, 7%, if it stays anything like this, is likely to have a huge effect on inflation. The budget deficit is still quite large, and that'll keep it going. So I don't predict a recession. And remember, one final thing. Tariffs are a bit like trade sanctions. Actually, technically, they are expansionary for the domestic economy that is experiencing them. So you will get an effect that'll start as a result of the tariffs domestically in the United States. So no recession.
Thank you very much, William, and thank you, Kate.